David Jackson was walking home late in the evening after a long workday. He enjoyed these moments, walking through the quiet, well-kept streets of the upscale neighborhood where he had recently bought a house. This area was a true dream, with its wide sidewalks, tall trees, and serene atmosphere. David had grown accustomed to this calm, which allowed him to relax and recharge after a hectic day at work. He never thought that moving into this neighborhood would raise questions for anyone. As a successful financial analyst, he was proud of his accomplishments and the fact that he could afford a home in such a place. While many neighbors were welcoming and friendly, David knew that not everyone saw him as one of them. This feeling became clear almost immediately after the move. Sometimes he would catch odd glances, as if someone was trying to figure out what he was doing in the neighborhood, but he didn't let it bother him, choosing to focus on his work and simply enjoy his new life. That evening, as he passed by houses with neat lawns, he thought about his upcoming tasks at work. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a patrol car slowly driving down the street. David noticed it out of the corner of his eye, but didn't pay much attention. Police often patrolled the area. However, this time something was different. The car slowed down and was driving right behind him. The car stopped nearby, and a second later, a police officer, Paul Richardson, got out. David felt the tension rising. He tried to stay calm, continuing to walk, but decided to stop so as not to provoke any unnecessary questions. The officer approached him with an expression that clearly showed he had doubts. The officer stared at David, as if assessing what he was doing in this neighborhood. David stopped and turned, meeting his gaze. Inside, he felt a mixture of irritation and helplessness. It was abundantly clear. His presence in this area raised suspicion for the officer. Paul Richardson began asking questions. First about what David was doing in the area where he lived, then asking to see his documents. David calmly replied that he was returning home and pulled out his ID from his pocket, showing it to the officer. He watched as Richardson studied the document, but from his expression, it was clear that the answer didn't satisfy him. For the officer, it wasn't enough, and there was no hint of politeness or respect in his actions. David knew that arguing with the officer was pointless. He had found himself in similar situations before, where his mere presence in the wrong place raised suspicion. This feeling had been familiar since childhood, always needing to stay on guard, always having to prove that he was just like everyone else. Nonetheless, it left an unpleasant aftertaste every time. The officer continued to ask questions, becoming more and more insistent in demanding that David explain what he was doing in the neighborhood. David continued to answer calmly, but inside, irritation was beginning to build. This was his home, his street, his right to walk down it without constant questioning and suspicion. But despite all his reasonable answers, the officer clearly wasn't going to let him go just like that. When it became clear that the officer wasn't satisfied with David's explanations and was preparing to arrest him, everything happened very quickly. David didn't even have time to realize it before he was handcuffed. His heart was racing, but he remained outwardly calm. He knew that resisting would be foolish. It would only make things worse. But inside, a feeling of anger and injustice was growing. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet he found himself in this situation simply because someone deemed his presence here inappropriate. The patrol car started moving, and David found himself in the back seat, handcuffed. Everything he had ever achieved, everything he had worked for, didn't matter at that moment. His success, his status, none of it was important in the face of the prejudice that had once again surfaced. As the car drove through the quiet streets, David looked out the window, but his thoughts were focused on what had just happened. This wasn't just an isolated incident, but a reflection of a deeper systemic problem. This had happened to other people, and he realized that it hadn't disappeared, even despite his personal achievements. He would have to decide how to respond to this incident, and he knew that this would mark the beginning of something bigger, possibly something that would change his life and the lives of others. David sat on a hard chair in a small room at the police station. The walls, painted in a cold gray color, created a sense of confinement and alienation. A computer stood on one of the tables in the corner, with several chairs for detainees nearby. There were no windows, only artificial light from a bright ceiling lamp. David remained calm, despite the injustice of what had happened. His hands were still cuffed, and in front of him stood the police officer, the same Paul Richardson who had arrested him on the street just a few minutes ago. The officer was staring at the computer screen, entering David's information to check his record and documents. Richardson was clearly hoping to find the slightest reason to justify his arrest, but there was nothing in the system. At that moment, Sergeant Thomas Williams entered the room, noticeably different from Richardson. Williams was older, with a more composed and serious demeanor, and there was doubt in his eyes about his colleague's actions. He silently observed as Richardson tried to find any justification for his suspicions, but came up with nothing. The situation was becoming more absurd by the minute. David, sitting in a police station for no valid reason, felt that justice should prevail, but it still seemed far away. Thomas Williams approached, wanting to better understand what was going on. He asked Richardson what had led to the arrest. Richardson, not losing his confidence, began explaining that David had aroused suspicion because he had been seen in an inappropriate neighborhood and had refused to explain his behavior. Williams, listening calmly to his version of events, glanced at David, who was sitting quietly, awaiting an explanation. The sergeant moved toward the computer and reviewed the results of the check. No violations, no suspicious data. Everything was clean, and there were no grounds for further detention. Williams realized that a mistake had been made and that Richardson's bias was to blame. The sergeant sighed heavily and turned to David. In his eyes, there was an expression of regret for what had happened. He ordered Richardson to remove David's handcuffs. The officer reluctantly complied, but his face still showed discontent. David stood up, rubbing his wrists, and cast a quick glance at Richardson, but said nothing. Williams tried to explain that it had all been a misunderstanding, attempting to smooth over the situation. Once the handcuffs were removed, Williams offered to step outside and talk. They left the stuffy room of the station and headed toward the exit. Outside, under the soft light of the street lamps, Williams apologized for what had happened. He explained that not all officers acted the same, and that he understood how unpleasant and unjust the situation had been for David. David listened calmly, but inside he felt a surge of indignation. Despite Williams' apology, he knew that the problem ran much deeper than a simple misunderstanding. This was the result of systemic bias that continued to exist even in such a prosperous area. Thomas Williams suggested that David file an official complaint with Internal Affairs if he chose to report Richardson's actions. He assured David that action would be taken if he decided to proceed. Williams was sincerely trying to resolve the issue on the spot, understanding that a mistake had been made. But David, while grateful for Williams's intervention, knew that this was far from over. This incident was just one of many, and deep down he was already formulating a plan on how to fight the bias he had experienced. He understood that this episode was just the tip of the iceberg, and that he couldn't simply forget what had happened. When David finally left the station, the cool evening air helped calm him down a little. However, it didn't change what had happened. He stepped onto the empty street and slowly walked home, thinking about what would come next. This incident had left a deep mark on him, and he knew he couldn't just let it go. David woke up early the next day after being released from the police station. He had spent the night reflecting on what had happened, and the morning greeted him with a clear resolve to get to the bottom of the situation. The entire ordeal, from the moment of his arrest on the street to the time he was freed, kept bothering him. He couldn't shake off the feeling of injustice. It seemed that this incident was just part of a broader problem, and now David felt he had to take action. His usual morning routine, a cup of coffee and a glance at the business news, didn't bring any satisfaction this time. Thoughts about work, projects, and financial forecasts temporarily faded into the background. A more important task lay before him. David decided that leaving the incident with the police without consequences would be wrong, both for himself and for others who might face similar treatment. He remembered Sergeant Thomas Williams's words, who had suggested that he contact Internal Affairs if he decided to file a complaint. Despite Williams's apology, David felt it wasn't enough. His arrest wasn't just a mistake. It was a clear example of bias on the part of Officer Paul Richardson. David understood that if he didn't act now, such situations could happen again, not only to him, but to others as well. Determined to act, David began by carefully documenting all the details of the previous evening's events. He knew that a precise and detailed record of every event would help him in the future. Everything, from the moment he noticed the patrol car to his time at the police station, was described in detail in his notes. David wanted to be prepared for anything and knew that without clear facts, his complaint could be ignored. Later that day, he contacted a lawyer he knew from business dealings. The lawyer, Eric Ellis, was an experienced professional and had worked with similar cases for a long time. After hearing David's story, Eric wasn't surprised. Unfortunately, such cases were not uncommon. Eric explained in detail what steps needed to be taken to file an official complaint against the police and ensure a fair review of the incident. The lawyer recommended starting with a written appeal to Internal Affairs and also advised David to prepare for the possibility that the process might be prolonged. David was ready for the fight, but understood that it would take time and effort. He knew he would face resistance, especially from those who had a vested interest in protecting the police's reputation. But despite this, he was determined to seek justice. Over the next few days, David drafted an official request to Internal Affairs, attaching his version of events along with all the collected materials. He carefully ensured that nothing was missed, describing every detail of the incident from the moment Richardson stopped him on the street. This was an important step for him, and he hoped that his appeal would be taken seriously. While preparing the documents, David also decided to speak with some of his neighbors. He knew that a few people might have witnessed the arrest and wanted to hear their perspectives. Many expressed their support, although some, noticing his request to discuss the incident, preferred not to delve into details. This silence also said a lot. Some neighbors simply didn't want to get involved, fearing it might disrupt their own peace. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Hazel, an elderly woman who often walked her dog in the neighborhood, said that she had seen the moment of the arrest and was shocked by what had happened. She confirmed to David that she hadn't noticed any wrongdoing on his part and was willing, if necessary, to officially confirm this. This support gave David confidence that he wasn't alone. Despite the complexity of the situation, David understood that this wasn't just a personal conflict. This case was part of a much larger issue of bias and injustice that many people faced. His goal now was not only to clear his name, but also to contribute to reducing such incidents in the future. Time passed, and David continued to follow his plan. He didn't rush and carefully thought through each step. It was important to him that his voice be heard and that this issue not go unnoticed. While waiting for a response from Internal Affairs, he realized that this was just the first step in a long journey. Several weeks had passed since David filed a complaint against Officer Paul Richardson. The waiting was agonizing, and although he tried not to dwell on it constantly, each day began with thoughts of what might come next. He continued living his usual life, working and taking care of everyday matters, but all the while, tension was building inside him. He understood that the process might take time, but the sense of injustice that had followed him since the incident wouldn't let go. Every morning started with him checking his mail, hoping for some notification from Internal Affairs. However, despite his expectations, no response came. Time passed, and it seemed the system was delaying the review of the case, leaving David unable to move forward. One morning, as he was preparing for another meeting with clients, his phone unexpectedly rang. The number displayed was unfamiliar, but he decided to answer. On the other end of the line was Sergeant Thomas Williams, the same officer who had helped him at the station on the day of his arrest. Williams's voice was serious and businesslike, as always. He informed David that the investigation of his complaint had been completed and that the case had now been forwarded to the department leadership for a final decision. David might be called in for a personal interview with the commission to discuss what had happened. This meant that his story was being taken seriously, and that important steps might be ahead in addressing the situation with Richardson. Although this was a small advancement, David realized that the process had finally started moving. Knowing that he would have to appear before the commission, he began preparing for the meeting. He reread all his notes, replaying every detail of the incident in his mind. It was important to him not only to defend himself, but also to convey to the department leadership that such cases should not be viewed as isolated incidents, but as part of a deeper problem. A few days later, David received an official notice of the hearing date. This wasn't just a discussion, it was a formal proceeding where he would have to make a statement before a commission, including senior police officers and a representative from Internal Affairs. For David, this was an important moment, a chance not only to clear his name, but also to contribute to ensuring that such cases wouldn't happen again. When the day of the hearing arrived, David felt a slight sense of anxiety. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but his determination left no room for doubt. Arriving at the police department building, he passed through security and headed to the meeting room, where the commission members were already waiting for him. The atmosphere in the room was restrained and formal. The seriousness of the matter was visible on the faces of those present. David first heard an opening statement from the police chief, who explained that the commission had gathered to review his complaint and that all the facts would be examined impartially. The chief emphasized that the department was committed to fairness and transparency in its actions. David listened to these words, but they remained just words for him. He was waiting for concrete decisions. When it was his turn to speak, he calmly and confidently recounted what had happened that night. He described every step, starting from the moment he noticed the patrol car to when he was released from the station. He tried not to leave out any details, focusing on how Officer Richardson's actions were unjustified and driven by bias. The commission listened to him attentively, asking clarifying questions. One of the officers asked a question that was on everyone's mind, trying to understand why Richardson had decided that David posed a threat. David was prepared for this question and explained that he believed his arrest was the result of racial bias, which still existed in society, even in such a prosperous neighborhood. After his statement, the commission members left the room to deliberate. Time passed slowly, and the tension began to build again. He couldn't know what their decision would be, but inside he was confident that he had done everything he could. When the commission members returned, the police chief announced that they had concluded their discussion and would soon inform him of their decision. He assured David that the complaint would be reviewed at the highest level and promised that if any violations were found, those responsible would be held accountable. David left the department feeling a sense of relief, but also with the understanding that his fight wasn't over. He knew that the results of the investigation could vary, but he still hoped for justice. Now, all that remained was to wait. Several weeks had passed since David's story gained public attention in the press. From the moment he decided to speak out about his unjust arrest, the situation around him began to change rapidly. At first, it was just articles in local newspapers and discussions on social media, but soon the attention to his case grew into something much bigger. People who had previously experienced similar injustices began to share their stories, and this led to a wave of outrage. Society finally began to realize that the problem was not limited to a single incident. It was a systemic crisis. Amid growing outrage over police actions and racial discrimination, peaceful protests began to organize in the city. People took to the streets, demanding justice and reforms in the law enforcement system. These were organized marches, with signs and slogans calling for equality and the protection of civil rights. The protests spread not only to the neighborhoods where David lived, but to many other areas of the city. The sense of injustice united people from different backgrounds, all striving for change. However, the more pressure came from the public, the more tense the police reaction became. Officers, including Richardson, began to perceive the demonstrations as a threat. Their presence on the streets intensified. Patrol cars and armed officers appeared on every corner. Although the protests remained peaceful, the police actions grew increasingly aggressive. Every march was accompanied by heightened control, arrests, and strict measures to maintain order. David, seeing the growing tension, couldn't stand idly by. He understood that the situation was spiraling out of control and that the police needed to be reminded of their duties to society. Together with Sergeant Thomas Williams, who had been on his side from the beginning, David decided to file a lawsuit against the police department. They accused the department of violating civil rights, particularly in the context of the unlawful actions of officers like Richardson. The lawsuit was not only about defending David's rights, but also about initiating broader reforms in the police force. The court case became yet another catalyst for the escalation of the conflict. In response to the lawsuit, Richardson and other officers began to crack down even harder on any form of protest. News reports increasingly covered the arrests of peaceful demonstrators who were being charged with disobedience or public disorder. The protests, which had started as peaceful calls for justice, had now become a battleground between the public and the police. One evening, as David was returning home, he stumbled upon a large march in the city center. Thousands of people, armed only with signs and their voices, were moving through the streets, calling for justice. The police had blocked the main roads, standing in full riot gear. The air was thick with tension, ready to escalate into confrontation at any moment. David watched the events unfold with concern. He understood that peaceful protests could easily turn into open conflict, and this thought troubled him deeply. He contacted Williams to discuss the possible consequences of the escalation. Both of them knew that the situation needed to be brought under control quickly, or the entire city could be drawn into a dangerous conflict. As they discussed possible actions, they agreed that the lawsuit should only be the first step. Their next goal would be to create a platform for dialogue between the protesters, the police, and local authorities. Meanwhile, the protests continued to grow. Every day, more and more people took to the streets, and the police, feeling the pressure, responded with increasing severity. In one district, a clash occurred that led to mass arrests. Local media began to cover the events actively, accusing the police of excessive use of force. David knew that they needed to act fast. Together with Williams and a team of lawyers, they prepared a statement demanding an immediate review of police tactics toward protesters and an independent investigation into the actions of officers who had violated citizens' rights. They approached local authorities with a proposal to hold open hearings where both sides could express their positions. However, the city administration was in no hurry to make concessions. With each passing day, the situation grew more tense. Officers, unaccustomed to such pressure from the public, acted increasingly aggressively. People who had once taken to the streets with peaceful demands now began to fear for their safety. The conflict was escalating, and the city was on the verge of open confrontation. Tension in the city continued to escalate. After David and Williams filed a lawsuit against the police department, the protests not only didn't subside, but began to attract even more participants. Every day, new groups of people took to the streets, demanding justice and reforms in the law enforcement system. The press increasingly focused on the situation, making it one of the top news stories. The protests, which had started as peaceful marches for equality and against racial discrimination, had now become a symbol of resistance. People of all ages and professions joined the demonstrations, feeling that their voices needed to be heard. However, the more people took to the streets, the more aggressive the police response became. Officers, including Paul Richardson, openly started using harsh measures to suppress the demonstrations. Arrests of participants became more frequent, and in some cases, the police even used force, which only added fuel to the fire. Every day, headlines about new arrests and confrontations on the city's streets appeared in the news. The atmosphere was becoming more and more tense. Richardson and his colleagues, who felt that their authority was being questioned, began acting even more harshly, not hiding their contempt for the protesters. At the same time, David and his lawyer, Eric Ellis, continued to gather evidence for the lawsuit against the police department, hoping that the legal system would bring justice. However, David knew that the situation had long since gone beyond just one court case. The city was engulfed in a wave of protests, and each day was becoming more dangerous. One such day, as David was returning home after a meeting with Williams, he heard the roar of a crowd on the main street. Protesters were marching toward City Hall, demanding immediate action from local authorities. This time, the police were no longer just standing by. They had formed a tight cordon and blocked access to the city center. The air was thick with tension. It would only take one spark for the situation to spiral out of control. David stopped at a safe distance, watching the events unfold. He saw how the protesters, despite the aggressive actions of the police, were not backing down. These were people tired of injustice, ready to fight for their rights to the end. It was at this moment that the first clash occurred. One of the officers, losing patience, grabbed a young man from the crowd and slammed him to the ground. The crowd reacted instantly, and a real stampede began. David watched as the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The police began using batons, and the protesters fought back, trying to protect their comrades. Soon, television cameras arrived on the scene, capturing the events. David realized that such clashes could only worsen the situation. Now it wasn't just the police and protesters in conflict, the entire city was at risk. Upon returning home, David immediately contacted Williams and told him what had happened. They discussed the next steps and understood that something had to be done quickly before it was too late. The next day, they prepared a joint statement condemning the police's actions and calling for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The statement was published in local newspapers and spread across the internet. David and Williams proposed that the authorities organize a meeting between the leaders of the protest movement and police representatives to find a compromise. However, despite their efforts, the situation continued to worsen. Meanwhile, concern began to grow within the police department. Richardson and his colleagues felt that control over the city was slipping from their grasp. They saw how David, along with the public, was increasing pressure on the department, and this caused them fear. The officers became even harsher in their actions, not bothering to hide their frustration. The protests were no longer seen as a peaceful expression of civil rights. To the police, it was an open challenge. David, observing the growing tension, understood that their lawsuit might only be the beginning of a more serious fight for civil rights. He continued to actively participate in building a public movement for reforms, working with lawyers and activists on a plan of action. New activist groups began to form in the city, proposing independent investigations into police actions and assessing the scale of civil rights violations. Each day brought new challenges, but David was determined. He knew he couldn't back down. Even with the danger of escalating conflict, he continued to believe that justice would prevail. His fight had become a symbol that the system could and should be changed, and he knew that now not only his personal rights were at stake, but also the future of the entire city. Several weeks had passed since protests had become a constant presence in the city. In response to the growing tension and dissatisfaction among residents, David, along with Sergeant Thomas Williams and his lawyer Eric, decided to organize a public forum. This was meant to be an opportunity for city residents, activists, and police representatives to meet face-to-face and discuss the issues that had been intensifying the societal atmosphere. The idea of the forum was to establish dialogue between the sides, preventing further escalation of the conflict. The forum took place at a local cultural center, chosen for its capacity and central location. On the day of the event, the hall was full. People came to speak out, listen to others, and hopefully find answers to the pressing questions. Among those present were local residents, human rights organizations, journalists, and representatives of the city administration. Police officers were also invited, including Officer Paul Richardson, who had become a symbol of the entire conflict. From the very start, the atmosphere was tense. People whispered about recent events, sharing their opinions on police brutality and discrimination. In the center of attention was David, the man whose story had sparked these changes. He, along with Thomas and Eric, delivered an opening speech, emphasizing the importance of peaceful dialogue and open discussion of the problems the city was facing. David spoke calmly, but there was determination in his words. He talked about his experience and noted that cases like his arrest affected not just one person, but the entire system that was supposed to serve the public. He stressed that to change the situation, dialogue was needed, where each side was willing to listen to the other and draw conclusions. After his speech, the floor was given to police representatives. Officer Richardson, unexpectedly for everyone, decided to speak as well. Many in the hall expected either an apology or an attempt to justify his actions. At first, his tone was restrained, and he tried to explain that on that night, he was simply doing his job, that he had no intention of violating David's rights or anyone else's. But the longer he spoke, the more evident his internal tension became. Soon, one of the activists from the crowd asked a direct question about racial discrimination. Why did you assume David was a threat solely based on his appearance? This question caught Richardson off guard. He tried to dodge the answer, but activists and local residents continued to press him with uncomfortable questions. The atmosphere in the hall heated up. The audience wanted to hear the truth. The longer the discussion went on, the more Richardson lost his composure. Under the pressure of the questions, he began to stumble in his responses and eventually switched to an aggressive tone, accusing the protesters of fueling the conflict. This was the moment when it became clear that he was unable to justify his actions and was certainly not ready to admit his guilt. His behavior only fanned the flames. At one point, Richardson couldn't hold back and loudly declared that the police always have reasons for their actions, and that the public doesn't understand the complexity of their work. These words sparked outrage in the hall. People began to express their dissatisfaction more vocally, accusing Richardson of racism and bias. The public's reaction to his speech was so negative that the police leadership present at the event realized immediate action was needed. The police chief, who had been quietly observing from the back rows, was forced to intervene. He took the floor and announced that the department would take measures to investigate Richardson's actions and review the complaints that had been filed regarding his behavior. This statement was met with applause from the audience. Finally, the public saw that the police were willing to respond to the demands for justice. The forum, which had started as an attempt at peaceful dialogue, became a turning point. Richardson, unable to handle the pressure and losing his temper, had effectively discredited himself before the public. His performance showed that he was not prepared for dialogue or for acknowledging his mistakes, which intensified the pressure on the police department to demand changes. The event caused a wide resonance in the media. Journalists quickly picked up the story, covering every moment of the tense discussion. That evening, local news stations aired footage of Richardson losing control, trying to justify his actions in front of an angry crowd. Discussions on social media only increased the pressure on the department. The next day, the police department issued an official statement announcing the start of an internal investigation into Richardson and other officers whose actions had been criticized. They also promised to review their policies regarding interactions with the public and protesters, giving people hope for long-awaited changes. David, Thomas, and Eric realized after the forum that this day had been a crucial milestone in their fight. The forum demonstrated that the public was ready for change, and the pressure on the authorities and police was so strong that it could no longer be ignored. People felt that their voices could be heard and that they had the right to demand justice and respect from those who were supposed to protect their rights. Now that the situation had reached a point of no return, David knew that there was still much work ahead. But he also understood that, thanks to the efforts of many people, this forum had become a turning point. There were new steps ahead, but this day proved that change was possible if you didn't give up and continued the fight. After the public forum was held, noticeable changes began to take place in the city. As a result of public pressure and media coverage, police leadership announced the start of an official investigation into the actions of Officer Richardson and other police officers. Not only individual incidents were being reviewed, but also the overall tactics of the police when dealing with protesters and city residents. Problems that had been long ignored were now under public scrutiny. One of the first outcomes of the investigation was the introduction of mandatory racial sensitivity training for all employees of the police department. These trainings were aimed at educating officers on how to better understand diversity, recognize cultural differences, and eliminate bias in decision-making. In addition, the department began actively implementing conflict de-escalation programs aimed at preventing the use of force in situations where it could be avoided. Officers were trained in how to engage in dialogue with citizens, defuse tense situations, and build trust with the communities they were supposed to protect. For David, these changes represented the first significant success. He saw how his efforts, along with those of Thomas and Eric, were starting to bear fruit. However, it was too early to celebrate. The introduction of trainings and changes in police culture was only the first step, and David understood that much more needed to be done to ensure these changes were long-lasting. In addition to the trainings, an independent oversight committee was established within the department. This committee consisted of civilians, representatives of human rights organizations, and legal experts. Their task was to monitor police actions and review complaints about officers' misconduct. Now, every potential violation of citizens' rights was not only reviewed within the police force, but also by independent bodies. This decision was a key step toward restoring trust between the police and city residents. The committee was granted wide powers to conduct its own investigations and provide recommendations for improving police work. This was an important innovation, as previously all complaints were handled internally, often resulting in no real consequences for the guilty parties. Now, the citizens had confidence that their complaints would be reviewed objectively and without internal police bias. David closely followed the work of the committee and often participated in public discussions organized within its framework. He wanted to make sure that this new mechanism was working effectively and that people were truly beginning to feel the changes. Expectations were high, and although changes were not happening instantly, David began to see the first signs that trust between the police and the community was starting to be restored. City residents, who had previously viewed the police with suspicion, now began to notice changes. Officers who had completed the training were becoming more attentive in their interactions with citizens. Officers who had previously reacted aggressively and harshly were now more often trying to establish dialogue with people, explaining their actions, and listening to the opinions of local residents. These small steps were making the city's atmosphere less tense, and David knew this was only the first victory on the path to deeper changes. Meanwhile, the investigation into Richardson continued. His behavior during David's arrest and subsequent incidents were the subject of thorough scrutiny. Under public and media pressure, the police leadership could no longer ignore the problem. Richardson was temporarily suspended from duty, and many suspected that his career in the department was over. His case became a symbol of the need for deeper changes in the system and proved that not only ordinary citizens but also officers must be held accountable for their actions. For David, this was an important moral victory. He saw that the fight for justice was starting to yield results. The system, which once seemed unshakable to him, was now beginning to move toward reform. But despite this, he understood that the fight was not yet over. There was still much work to be done, and he knew he couldn't stop at what had already been achieved. He continued to work with Thomas and Eric, meeting with leaders of community organizations, discussing the next steps. They knew that the training and the oversight committee were only the beginning. To achieve real change, new approaches needed to be implemented in the everyday work of the police. Their attitude towards citizens had to be reconsidered, and new standards of conduct had to be developed for emergency situations. For David, this journey was not just about the fight for justice. He understood that everything he had gone through had become part of a broader struggle for equality and human rights. He knew that there was still a long road ahead, but he was ready to keep moving forward, knowing that each step brought him closer to a more just and equal society. Several months had passed since the public forum, and subsequent events had changed the city. A lot had changed during this time. Thanks to the efforts of David, Eric, and Thomas, real, tangible changes took place in the police department. Sensitivity training on racial issues became a mandatory part of the training for all new officers. The police began undergoing conflict de-escalation programs, and the results of these changes were already visible on the streets. The previous aggression from officers, which had long poisoned relations between the police and the public, was gone. People began to feel safer, seeing the police not as a threat, but as partners ready to protect their rights. Officer Richardson, whose actions had led to such a heated conflict, was officially dismissed after the investigation was completed. His name had become a symbol of what the city had decided to eradicate forever: prejudice and discrimination. But for David, this dismissal was not the end goal, just a step along a long path. Much more important were the changes that had now taken root in the department's structure, forcing the police to rethink their approach to the residents. The city was starting to change, but for David, it was only the beginning. He felt that his work was far from over. Everything he had gone through in the past months had taught him how important every individual's voice is in the fight for justice. Now that his experience had become an example for many, David began to consider that he could do more if he expanded beyond just one city. He began discussing his ideas with Eric and Thomas. Each of them had seen how this crisis had grown into something greater, a movement for human rights. Their experience of battling the system and interacting with different social groups showed how important it was for such stories not to be silenced, but to become part of a broader discourse. Together, they decided to create a platform that would help other people who had faced injustice. David set out to create an organization that would not only defend people's rights, but also help them fight discrimination wherever it appeared. The platform was to become a place where one could receive legal support, educational resources, and the opportunity to draw attention to any cases of human rights violations. The main idea was that people could feel they were not alone in their struggle, knowing that there were resources and people ready to support them. The organization was named New Path, symbolizing what they had begun to create: a new path to justice and equality for all. The early days were filled with work on structuring the project. David, Thomas, and Eric assembled a team of lawyers, human rights defenders, and experts on racial and social discrimination to create an effective tool for support. The platform was designed to cover a wide range of areas, from fighting bias in the justice system to defending labor rights and ensuring equal access to education. They started small, with meetings with residents who were ready to share their stories. But soon, interest in New Path began to grow. People from all over the region started reaching out for help, understanding that they would be supported and that their problems would be heard. David felt that the work, which had begun with his personal fight for justice, was turning into something much bigger. He had become not just a symbol of change, but a true leader of a movement whose activities had an impact far beyond the city. One day, after a long workday, David stayed alone in his office, reviewing the latest reports and requests for help from people who had reached out to them. He remembered how his journey had begun, with an unjust arrest on a quiet walk down a peaceful street. Back then, he couldn't have imagined that this event would change his entire life. But now he understood that that day was just the beginning of his long path. For David, this path had not been easy. He had faced bias, threats, and pressure, but he had not backed down. He had learned that the fight for justice requires patience and determination. Now, his goal was to create a world where every person, regardless of skin color, gender, or social status, could feel protected and equal under the law. New Path became not just an initiative, but a human rights movement that brought together many people ready to fight for their rights and the rights of others. David knew that there were still many challenges and problems ahead, but he felt ready to face them. Every new story they took on, every case they handled, strengthened his confidence that they were on the right path. A new chapter of his life had begun. David was no longer just a financial analyst living in an upscale neighborhood of the city. He had become a defender of human rights, someone who fought against injustice, and someone who helped others find their voice. His personal experience had turned into the foundation for something bigger, and he was determined to continue on this path. He knew that there was still a long road ahead in the fight for equality, but this didn't scare him. On the contrary, it gave him strength. Now he looked to the future with confidence, knowing that every step, every small victory, was a step on the path to a greater, long-term result.